My name's Catherine Dupeloup-Ménager, and I'm the artistic director of the festival. I've just come to explain that the man in the white T-shirt is not the man to my right, in case you hadn't noticed. Tim Ailiff, unfortunately, is unable to join us, and we've got, Tim wouldn't like me to say this, somebody who could conceivably be even better, because Michael Duffy, who was one of the co-founders of BAD, and a round of applause, I think, is appropriate at this point. We wouldn't be here without him. Michael Duffy was a journalist, as Tim still is. He's a novelist and he writes true crime. So he covers absolutely all the bases, and thank you for stepping in at short notice.
Thanks, Catherine.
Enjoy yourselves.
So yeah, I only patched these questions together last night, so excuse me if they're a bit rickety, but I'm sure with these guests we'll have no problems. It's actually a real pleasure to be here with these three people in particular. In a professional capacity, I deal with Emma from time to time, and she's one of the top crime journalists in Sydney. And as for Mark and Michael, when we actually founded BAD, started thinking about it in early 2016, we knew we actually had to get the support of someone from the fiction side in writing and someone from the non-fiction / professional side. And these were the two people that we approached for support, because Mark at that point was a senior Crown prosecutor, but also a writer. And Michael, he was probably too young to be called the godfather of Australian crime writing then, but he was certainly a made man. Anyway, he was...
Just don't call me a veteran.
But this was a time when it was just before The Dry was published. It was before, Chris Hammer came along. It was before Candace Fox achieved her huge success in America. It was a very different time. It's funny how much has changed in that period. And we needed the support of these people if we were going to get other writers to come, if we were going to get places like this to allow us to hold the festival in them. And not least importantly, if we were going to persuade people like the City of Sydney to give us money. So we're very lucky that they gave us their support, especially in those early years when, every festival was a bit of a struggle, and it's helped us grow to the point, hopefully, where we're a bit on the calendar now, I hope. So anyway, let's get going for the formal part of the event. I'd like to acknowledge the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation, whose land we're on, and extend a particularly warm welcome to any Aboriginal Torres Strait Islander people who are here today. Just to give a little bit more detail, Mark Tedeschi was for many years the senior Crown prosecutor in New South Wales, and I think, is it right to say you acted for the former monarch, or you in court? Or you?
I did indeed. I was able to say to people I was such a poor barrister that the only client I had was an old lady in England.
That's right. And he's switched in the last few. He's now left that job. He's now at the private bar, and he's now a KC, of course, not a QC anymore. I've just been told that apparently is an automatic switch. He's a King's Counsel. Very nice. Emma Partridge has been a writer in the print media for the Sydney Morning Herald, the Daily Telegraph, where she came upon this story, if I'm not mistaken, about the widow of Walker, which we'll be talking about today. It's the subject of her book. And she's now a senior crime editor for Channel 9 News. You've probably seen her on the television quite often. Michael Robotham is a hugely successful crime writer. He's not only written a large number of best-selling novels, and they've sold well around the world, but they've been turned into TV. And I think you've even won twice the UK's Gold Dagger Award, which is all fantastic. His latest book is called Lying Beside You, and we'll be talking about that soon. Anyway, let's get going. Can you just join me before we start in welcoming our guests? So, Mark, do you mind just telling us in less than 500 words what your book is about? And so, Missing Presumed Dead is your latest book. I should just say that Mark wrote a couple of historical true crime books, which are very good. I particularly recommend one he wrote on the Mile Massacre, where he was able to use his experience as a prosecutor to provide extra insight into the actual prosecutor in that case. But anyway, this time round, Mark's written a book based on one of his own prosecutions, or some of his own prosecutions. But you did so many. Why did you pick this one?
Missing Presumed Dead is about the trials of a man by the name of Bruce Burrell for two murders, the murder of Kerry Whelan and the murder of Dorothy Davis. There were two women who were well known to him that he abducted and murdered, and was eventually convicted. I was looking around for one of my own cases to write about, but there's no tradition of prosecutors in Australia writing about their own cases. And I was very apprehensive that I might be criticised for doing so. But when Bruce Burrell died in 2016, I thought, well, here's the opportunity. He can't sue me. And his convictions were uncontroversial, so I thought this is an opportunity. But I was still hesitant to give my manuscript to my publishers. But when my former boss, DPP Nicholas Cowdery, wrote his autobiography and wrote about the cases he'd prosecuted, I thought, well, if he can do it, I can do it. And so I gave it to my publishers.
And I think a lot of us would be familiar with the outline of that story to do with Bruce Burrell, but something I hadn't realised, he possibly had a third victim, didn't he?
There was a man who disappeared off the face of the earth, just like Dorothy Davis and Kerry Whelan, prior to those two women disappearing. There was never enough evidence to prosecute Bruce Burrell, but the suspicion is very high that he was involved. Bruce Burrell wanted to buy his house. He was a very frail, elderly man who had decided he wanted to stay in his house until his days were up. And one day his wife went out to play bingo at the local club. She came home and her husband Charlie had disappeared off the face of the earth, never to be seen. And they lived near to Lurline Bay. The police thought, oh, he must have somehow got out of his house, walked over to the cliffs and jumped off the cliffs into the sea and got washed out to sea. And of course, that was never a possibility. I mean, for a start, you couldn't jump off the cliffs. You would have had to climb off the cliffs because they're layered there. So that could never have happened that way. So his disappearance remained completely unexplained.
How much? What year was that? Where did that relate in the timeline? To
about a year or two before the disappearance of Dorothy Davis in 1995. Okay. So it was somewhere around 93, 94. And his wife was utterly convinced that there was foul play involved. And she was willing to sell their house. He was not. And Bruce Burrell was the kind of man who wouldn't let that stand in his way if he wanted to buy a house. And he thought, he was
and
a
so
complete
did Burrell end up buying the house?
He ended up changing his mind. He decided not to buy the house. Yeah.
Wow. All right. Emma, I've got to ask you the same question. You've covered so many stories, so many big stories. Why did you decide to write a book about this one?
Well, Michael, this was a case that I'd come across, and I think I'd been a crime reporter for 7 or 8 years at the point where I learned about this woman called Natasha Darcy, and it still is the most fascinating case I've ever come across. All the twists and the turns, and I think this session is called "The Truth is Stranger Than Fiction," and this is what I think about this case. It's about a woman who targeted men for their money, and ended up targeting this lonely farmer in a town called Walker near Tamworth. And she preyed on people's vulnerabilities. But the most wild part about this story was that she murdered this farmer, and then the first man on the scene to the farmer's death was her ex-husband, somebody that she had also tried to kill. And so he was the first paramedic on the scene to this. So it was that initial twist when I learned of that, and from there the things that she did and the way she tried to cover up her crime. I've never come across anything quite like it.
Extraordinary story. It's a new twist on Farmer Needs a Wife, isn't it? That's
Yeah.
for sure. Yeah. It seems to me there are actually fewer true crime books being produced by journalists these days, because journalists are incredibly busy and often don't have time to stay with a particular story. But obviously you had the time to do this. And I think did you break the story? I know you certainly won a number of awards for your coverage of it.
Yes, I got wind of it, and so I went to the town of Walker because my sister had called me, and we had some family friends that lived in the town that had told my sister that there was this black widow living in the town, and nobody could understand why she hadn't been arrested, that the entire town was certain that she'd murdered Matthew Dunbar, and they were worried and wondering why she hadn't been arrested. So I went up there in my capacity as a journalist at the Daily Telegraph and interviewed Natasha before she was arrested and confronted her. She was arrested a couple of days after I confronted her. So I spent quite a few weeks in the town speaking to all of Matthew's friends and neighbours, all of whom were convinced that Matthew wouldn't have taken his own life, as she was telling everybody. And she had set up this story in the months leading up to his death that he was depressed when he certainly wasn't.
Michael, we're talking about fact and fiction a bit anyway, and I was just wondering, are you inspired at all by fact when you've written so many stories? The idea is, where do they come from?
I never use the word inspired, because the idea that a crime would inspire anyone, I find a bit sort of, but they're all seeded, absolutely seeded in and I love what Emma said about, the Widow of Walker is a classic example that if I had written that as a novel, no one would have believed it. And I think this is the great benefit that non-fiction has over fiction. When I look back through a long career in journalism, there are so many stories that are just amazing, but I knew if I put them into fiction, no one would believe them. It's almost as though in fiction, I find you have to tone the truth down to make it more palatable. The example I always give is that, like 10 years ago, if I'd written a crime novel about a guy who imprisoned his daughter in a basement and fathered 7 children by her, people would have said, "Get away! That's never going to happen." And then obviously Joseph Fritzl turns up. And this is my constant battle. Oftentimes is to actually make fiction more believable by not having. We talk about as a fiction writer. I think it was that said, you cannot write with God on your lap. Like, you cannot rely on outrageous coincidences, because in fiction, the reader just won't buy it. But in real life, we all know, like that idea of the first paramedic that turns up at the scene of this death is the ex-husband of the woman that's just, killed. You could not put that in a novel and have readers accept it or believe it. And so I think there's a lot to be talked about in terms of where you get the greater truth. But I do think that, it's really, my books are seeded in real life stories, but then I find I have to tone them down to make them believable.
Tell me if I'm on the wrong track here, but it just seems in talking to fiction writers, there always has to be a seed somewhere in reality. In theory, you think you could just sit down at your desk and think, I'll invent a crime today. But it's amazing how almost always it does come from somewhere. It's like that slight link to reality is quite important, isn't it?
Yeah, certainly for me, because my background is very similar to Emma's. I started it as a journalist, and I find that I have to create books that are set in real places. I don't create fictional towns so much so that I'm one of the few. I know my British publishers say I'm one of the few novelists they have that has to be legaled, because they go through my book and they'll say, okay, that house you mentioned in the opening chapter, and you describe what corner it's on, and you cite the colour and describe it in great detail. Does that house exist? Yes. And is it on that corner? Yes. Well, you have to change it. You've just put 3 bodies in their front room, and so and I hate having to change it, because in my head that's a real place and that's where the crime took place. But I understand why I have to change it. But there are some writers. A classic example is Harlan Coben, the American crime writer, and he would happily put a skyscraper in the middle of Sydney Harbour. And if someone said to him, "You do realise there's no skyscraper in the middle of Sydney Harbour," he'd go, "It's fiction. I make it up. Live with it." Yeah, but not me. I think I have to base it as much in reality as I can.
And the latest book lying beside you, do you want to tell us where that idea was seeded?
It's seeded. It goes. The idea. I guess the best description I can give, because it's a 3rd book in a series, although it can be read as a standalone, but there's a character narrator called Evie Cormack in there, a young woman who can tell when someone's lying. And I've had this almost lifelong fascination with lying. And I guess it first came about because many, many years ago, I read the wonderful Oliver Sacks book, The Man Who Mistook His Wife for a Hat. And in that he mentions being in a hospital and watching a room full of aphasia patients who were looking at a TV screen, and Ronald Reagan was being interviewed. It was during the Iran-Contra hearings or after that. And Ronald Reagan just could not recall. I cannot recall. I cannot recall. I cannot recall. And these patients were laughing at the screen. And now everyone that knew about that case knew that the president was lying, but these patients had no concept of who he was and what that issue was. And when Oliver Sacks said to them, "What do you mean?" And they said, "Well, he's lying." And how can you tell? He said, "But there, you can see it on his face. He's lying." And he became fascinated with how they knew what they were picking up on, what micro expressions is a term that came up much later. So I became interested in this idea of lies and lying, and whether there were people walking amongst us that had the ability a better ability than average, because the average is 50-50, to tell when someone's lying. And I've created a character, Evie Cormack, and these people do exist, and she can tell when someone's lying.
That's a great idea. Mark, I've just realised I haven't written down a question I should ask you, because we're talking about fact and fiction. Your first book about, is it Eugenia Fellini? Can you just tell us about that particular part of her life that was just so wildly implausible?
My first book, called Eugenia, is about a woman called Eugenia Fellini, who lived life as a man by the name of Harry Crawford for 20 years in Sydney between 1900 and 1920. And in 1920, Harry was charged with the murder of his first wife. In the meantime, he had remarried. And today we recognise the issue of transgender people and gender dysphoria, but you can imagine in 1920 there was just no understanding whatsoever about those issues. When the police went to speak to Harry's second wife, they said, "Well, we've got two pieces of news for you." And she said, "Okay, what's the first piece?" And they said, "Well, your husband has been charged with the murder of his first wife." Well, that was a big shock to her, because she didn't know about the first wife. And she thought, "Well, that must be the bad news. Tell me the good news." And the policeman then said, "Well, your husband is actually a woman." And she laughed at them and said, "Well, you're wrong, because I'm pretty sure that I'm pregnant." It turned out she was not. But Harry had lived for 20 years and had been married twice, and neither wife knew that he was anything other than a full-blooded Aussie male. So it was quite an extraordinary story. And you can imagine that in 1920, Harry was treated so abysmally. Eugenia was treated, when she was exposed as having crossed the gender divide, her crime of crossing the gender divide was almost more serious than the murder that she was charged with. So the book is about her story, her life story, but also about the trial that she underwent as Eugenia and the incredibly bad treatment that she got.
There's actually, that's a really good example of when I wrote a book called The Secret She Keeps, about a woman who fakes the pregnancy and steals a baby. Some of the criticism I got was that people did not believe that a woman could hide a pregnancy from her boyfriend for the 9 months. Surely, what sort of idiot wouldn't realise that his girlfriend isn't really pregnant? And I kept trying to say, no, it's not that difficult. Now, if someone can pretend to be a man for 20 years and have 2 marriages, then I think mine wasn't that far-fetched.
Well, in fact, Mark, you prosecuted Kelly Lane, who managed to keep her pregnancy. I mean, it's the same thing exactly.
Yeah, very much so. And look, the strangest case that I have ever prosecuted is a story so bizarre that if somebody like Michael wrote it, it wouldn't sell. You could never sell it. It was a man who decided that he would fake his own death to claim on an insurance policy. And the idea that he had was that he would abduct a taxi driver, kill the taxi driver, take the body to Circular Quay in the taxi, put the body into a surfboard bag, dress up as a surfie, get onto the Manly ferry, put his own ID on the body, make sure that it was a very tempestuous, rainy day when everybody would be inside the ferry, take the body in the surfboard bag to the front of the ferry, throw it off so that it would get churned up by the propeller and they wouldn't realise that it wasn't him. The police would find the body, they'd find the ID, his ID on the body. They would assume it was him, they'd assume he was dead, he would be able to claim on the policy, and he'd written to one of his relatives in England to make the claim. Now, just so that he got the story right, he wrote it out in full in his longhand, and then he started on this venture, and he actually did kill a taxi driver. So it's a very tragic tale.
Mark, you should write a book about this.
Michael's taking notes.
I mean, who would believe that? But if I told you the rest of the story, you'd say, well, the first part is very ordinary in comparison. And that was and believe it or not, although the police found the whole story in his own handwriting, he pleaded not guilty and went to trial.
I mean, that sounds really similar to the villain in The Widow of Walker, in terms of, on the one hand, you think, oh, there's some ingenious planning going on. And then on the other hand, you're thinking, oh my God, how naive was she? And,
Well, I was just thinking, Mark, when you were saying that the first part of the plan, which sounds outrageous, but then when you go into the detail, it's the other things that you can't believe. And I feel like in the Widow of Walker's case, in Natasha's case, the paramedic situation and that was already strange, but it's the things that she did afterwards that were even more bizarre. And one of the reasons why I decided to write the book, I was sitting in a pre-trial hearing just before the trial started, and they were having an argument about tendency evidence and all these evidence that are coming up about how she had tried to kill her ex-husband by poisoning his oysters, Kilpatrick, and the tacos, and then to explain all the drugs in his system, she then put a fake box of poisoned chocolate Cadbury almonds on the bench and was very adamant in telling the police to take that box of almonds and test those almonds. And what she'd done was she'd written a letter to the actual Cadbury chocolate factory in Victoria and said that she'd poisoned 5 boxes of chocolate Cadbury almonds as a ruse, as a decoy, so that when her husband was found with the drugs in his system, she could say, "He ate the almonds. I knew they tasted funny. It was the almonds." So it was all the bizarre food related things that she was doing.
I mean, I never cease to be amazed by the crazy things that people do when they commit serious crime. I mean, take, for example, a man, I can't remember if you covered this case, Michael, Desmond Campbell. He married a woman, a middle-aged woman.
Oh, yeah, this is fascinating. Yeah.
Convinced her to transfer her home into their joint names. And then a few months after their marriage, he takes her camping in the Royal National Park on the edge of a cliff, and woe and behold, she goes over the cliff in the middle of the night. Now, you would think he would have gone to her funeral. No. Instead, he went to Bali with his girlfriend. I mean, what insanity is that?
It's funny. One of the when I was a ghostwriter, one of the people I ghostwrote for was a man called Professor Paul Britton, who was a pioneer of offender profiling in the UK. And I ghostwrote a book called The Jigsaw Man, and another called Picking Up the Pieces. And Paul worked on, the Fred and Rosemary West case and Jamie Bolger and a lot of those things. And one of the things that he stressed to me was that, I have this big thing about, arch criminals. They really only exist, these super criminals, in novels. Very rarely in real life do you have a criminal with that much, nous, But he said, invariably, he said, enormous planning can go into the lead up. He said, but people don't plan what happens afterwards, and that's where they get caught. They get caught because they don't plan in the aftermath.
They go to Bali afterwards with the girlfriend.
It's funny. That's a really interesting case because it's funny. When Michael asked me earlier about if I'm on the lookout for things that make good novels, and that's one of the cases I looked at. And the other one was the Baden Clay murder. That idea of the husband murdering, had a mistress and murdered, because that involved. I mean, I have this theory when it comes to I guess I think it's exactly the same with non-fiction writers of crime, true crime writers, is that most murders are tragically mundane. You know, when two guys get into an argument in a pub car park and one drives his ute up, it's not going to make a great non-fiction book, and it's not going to make a great novel. The great novels and great non-fiction books come when you have these amazing coincidences, or the twists and turns, or
And the planning.
the planning that
of the
goes
murder
in.
and why they're planning.
Yeah,
the
and
murder.
so that's why I look at cases like the Baden Clay case, and now that could be the basis of a novel, because of the ins and outs, and he almost gets away with it, and I think that's what you need.
Emma, talking about what happens afterwards, can you tell us a bit about Walker? What sort of place was it? And you said that people in town were suspicious. Can you just tell us the story? How did that play out?
Actually, it was Jen in the crowd here knows that the people of Walker, in particular, Matthew, the farmer's closest friend, Lance Partridge, sort of the fabric of the community. It's just a very tight-knit community. I think it's a town of about 1,200 people, very misty, beautiful town, a lot of artists, retirees, farmers, and everybody knows everybody's business. So walking down the street, you'd say hello to everyone, you know what's going on. So it was very strange when this woman, who was an out-of-towner, she was actually from Sydney, had moved to town with the paramedic that she later tried to kill by burning the house down. So everybody, the talk was thick and fast when she burnt the house down with Colin inside of it. Everyone was already suspicious of her at that point in time. So they were worried when she started the relationship with Matthew, because they knew of her background, and everybody loved Matthew. He was a very much loved farmer. He was a very lonely man. He lived on a beautiful property on the outskirts of Walker by himself, and everybody was confused and only thought she was after one thing, which was his money, when she struck up a relationship with him. So I think everybody was worried in the lead up to it, and the thing that I didn't find out until the trial and after her arrest was that the police were actually looking into whether she was trying to kill Matthew at the time that she did, which I thought was fascinating. They were just about to start an investigation. The local police officer, Anthony Smith, had so many concerns from the residents that he went to Tamworth, the biggest station nearby, and he put his hand up in a meeting and said, I think there's a bloke in Walker that's going to be killed. What do I do about it? What can we do here? So they were looking at tapping her phones and what they could do to stop her. It's a bit hard to investigate what someone's trying to do before they do it. And it's just so sad that she was successful in the end before they could stop her.
I just imagine there's a lot of women in the audience taking notes of what not to do. What not to do when I want to kill my husband.
Don't Google how to murder someone, as she did. 99 ways to get away with murder. That's what
And
she
once it had actually happened, were the police onto it straight away, or?
They knew straight away.
Yes,
Anthony Smith, the local officer in Walker, said that when he got the call saying that somebody had died out at Pandora, the farm, he said, she's done it. I can't believe it. Everything we thought was going to happen, she's done it. And all the police that worked on the case say that had she done this in another town, she would have got away with it. It would have looked like a suicide. She'd staged his death to look like a suicide, but because they knew of her prior history and all the complaints, it was the people of the town that had brought her to the police's attention. They didn't treat it as a suicide, so they immediately had detectives on the scene. They immediately went to check out her story, which didn't add up from the get-go. All the things she said she'd done, which she hadn't. And so, they treated it as suspicious the moment they arrived there. And I think that's because of the town and the closeness and the tight-knit community of the town.
Wow. Michael, I'd better ask you at least one question about the nominal title of this session. You've been a journalist. I'm sure you've got a strong grasp of reality. What's the major way, do you reckon, that crime fiction tends to differ from the reality of true crime?
I think our criminals tend to be more intelligent. We don't sort of have our villains making the sort of stupid mistakes that often occur in real life. We do want to pit our protagonist against someone that is trying to outsmart the system and outsmart them. I think, other than that, we're trying to get to the similar sort of truths in terms of, investigating, society's ills and issues and the darker recesses of the human psyche and all sorts of things like that. But I think it's always been this great debate about where the greater truth lies, in fiction or non-fiction. There are, it's funny, when I wrote non-fiction, when I was a ghostwriter, there was a great comfort in having all the material in front of you. I mean, you had to do the research and get all the interviews, but you could do. I find that when I thought writing fiction would be easier, but in fact, making something up from nothing is far more difficult than having characters already there. But other than that, I think it is about. We're looking for grand passion in a crime fiction. In crime fiction, we're looking at the great sins. Whether it be lust or greed, or we're looking for grand passions to be the drivers and the motive behind these things. Whereas obviously in real life crime, often they're not. It's some stupid drunken, mistake or accident or wherever.
Part of my interest in writing true crime is that I'm absolutely fascinated by people with severe narcissistic traits, and I've found that quite a few of the people that I've prosecuted for major crime, and in fact 2 of my books have been about severe narcissists, and I find them absolutely fascinating. And what marks them out as being different is that they've got this incredible belief in themselves that they're of superior ability and that they'll never get caught because they can see things and plan for them in advance that other people wouldn't be able to do. But in reality, they're leaving traces, they're leaving evidence along the way.
They're not as smart as they think they are.
They're not nearly as smart. And if you take Bruce Burrell, for example, 3 weeks before he abducts and murders Kerry Whelan, he goes unexpectedly to her property for no apparent reason to visit her. If he hadn't have done that, he may have got away with it. I mean, how incredibly stupid.
I agree. I think that that a lot of killers are narcissists, and Natasha Darcy is definitely a narcissist too. And she thought she was incredibly intelligent. I don't think she would have got away with it, but it certainly didn't help that she Googled all the methods that she ended up using, and left a trace on her mobile phone.
Laugh.
But and then Googled, can the police trace my search history?
Can police search deleted text message history or Facebook messages?
Mark, just switching track a little bit, in the case of Bruce Burrell, as with the more recent one of Chris Dawson, the teacher's pet, and indeed another one of yours, the famous one, Kelly Lane, there's no body. So these are convictions obtained on circumstantial evidence. Can you just tell us a little bit about how do you put together a circumstantial case so it's strong enough to convince the law and the jury?
Look, a lot of people make the mistake, Michael, of thinking that a circumstantial case is necessarily weaker than a direct evidence case, and nothing could be further from the truth. A circumstantial case is a little bit like a jigsaw puzzle, with each piece of evidence being a piece of the puzzle. And if you have enough pieces of the puzzle, you might be missing some at the end. Inevitably, there'll be something that you can't prove, but you can still see what the picture is. So circumstantial cases can be really strong.
Is that, sorry, yeah. In the case of something like, in the case of something like the Chris Dawson conviction, because it was I can understand that completely when you've got a judge only trial. But I guess a question I'd like to ask you is that, we've sort of now had decades of these shows that, forensic based sort of crime dramas and whatnot. And it has created a situation where the jury just expects the smoking gun. They expect the forensic evidence.
Very, very much so. We call it the CSI effect. If you don't have some DNA, why not? I mean, if you watch CSI, you just go in and, it's so easy to get DNA. Well, in fact, often a prosecutor will call evidence as to why there's no DNA. Or fingerprints, and how hard it is sometimes to get that evidence, because, as you say, a lot of jurors who are not experienced in criminal law don't know that you don't necessarily get that sort of evidence.
And is that why a circumstantial case would be more difficult to run in front of a jury?
In some cases, yes. But Michael, you were asking about proving death without a body. obviously, as a prosecutor in a murder trial, you have to prove death. If you have a body, it's not hard to prove death. But there are a whole lot of other ways to prove death without a body. And if you have somebody like, for instance, Kerry Whelan, who had a very active life, a very loving family, suddenly disappears off the face of the earth and has no contact with a single solitary person in her life, has a large bank account that she doesn't touch, no Medicare access, no access to anything at all that you would normally expect a person to have access to, it's not hard to prove death. So you can. What's a lot harder is to prove the death of a newborn, like in the Kelly Lane trial, where that newborn obviously doesn't have a bank account and a Medicare card and things like that. So it's a lot harder in a case like that.
Emma, you've been a crime reporter for a while now. What effect does it have on you, or even have you noticed it has on your colleagues? Because it's pretty grueling subject matter.
I ask myself that quite often, and more lately. I think I've been doing it for more than a decade now, and I find myself getting more emotional. I was only in a sentence hearing last week, and I wrote an email during it to my work and said, I'm not covering this. It's just too gruesome. There's no public interest in reporting on this crime. The crime is too gruesome. I think as I've become older, I've become more sensitive to it. And I think it does have an effect on you. I'm sure it does on prosecutors and lawyers and the police. I think I probably drink too much red wine sometimes after certain cases. And I do find myself getting teary, or my partner's in the crowd. I can be a bit nasty sometimes, I guess, and lose my temper. I think it has, I think it's played with my emotions somewhat. And I don't think it's something I will do forever because of that.
And it's interesting. Paul, I mentioned earlier, Paul Britton, the psychologist, and you know, most detectives, you know, homicide detectives, will cover a limited number of homicides in their career, and you know, prosecutors will prosecute a certain number of murders. But I think at one point he had done 100. He'd been, you know, done 100 crime scenes, you know, and he talked about it, not about. And often they get called in when the crime is beyond the comprehension. It's so vicious and violent. I mean, did you need a psychologist to explain why one human being would do that to another human being? So they tend to be on the very extreme scale. And he talked about it not being that, he said it's not that you bring your work home with you. He said you leave a little part of your humanity behind each time you're there, until eventually you have less to give, because something, you just sacrifice something each time.
I find that the subject matter is obviously distressing, but what I find the most upsetting is watching the impact that it has on the family members. So watching them crying and watching their grief and dealing with people who are always in grief, and how they move on for that affects me almost more than the actual details of a crime, is that the way the crime has affected the people that are left behind.
You know, it's true, isn't it? You know, if you're murdered, it's horrible, but it's usually over pretty quickly. Whereby for the family, it's it goes on, just goes on. Mark, what about lawyers? Any impact there, do you think? I mean, there must be.
Look, it varies from lawyer to lawyer. I think if you're a prosecutor or a defence counsel, it's really important to try and maintain that objectivity and a degree of emotional distance. And I found in most cases I was able to, but every now and again there'd be a case that would just, you know, it's like being socked to the guts. And there have been two cases that I've done. One was a murder trial and one was a child sex case, where I literally refused to listen to the evidence myself. It was just too gruesome, and I knew that if I did listen to the evidence, it would always be there. I'd never be able to get rid of it. And I thought, I'm entitled to protect myself from that. And so I was able to do the cases without actually seeing the evidence. I knew what was there. I could make submissions on it, but I didn't have to actually physically look at it. But you know, some of my colleagues, when I was senior Crown prosecutor, were unable to do child sex cases at all. I don't know whether that was because of their own backgrounds or just because they were sensitive people, but you had to be careful who you gave those cases to. and you had to
Same with the
rotate
police.
them.
The police, there's a lot of police that can't do
Yeah.
the child sex offences as
That's
well.
right.
And yeah, you can understand why.
That's right. Yeah.
Yeah, no, I became aware of this when I was a journalist, much younger, and I was at the Crown Prosecutor's office in Campbelltown, I think, and I was talking to a young solicitor. I think she would be maybe late 20s, early 30s, and she had 2 small kids, and she said she spent the last week looking at 10,000 images, of child sex abuse, and that was her job. That's what she gets paid for. It's very hard for the rest of us to understand. Michael, just changing the subject, but still sticking with experience and so on. Your career, you've written a lot of books. Does it get easier or harder? And the ideas come as readily? Do they come more readily? Just what's it like to be a professional writer working at that level?
I've been a professional writer since I was 17, really. Look, I think it's because of the way I write, I don't plot and plan the book. And I think the great advantage of when I was a ghostwriter doing someone's autobiography was that you knew where the book began and you knew where the book ended. And whereas when I write a novel, I liken it to the fact I start with the seed of an idea. With a book like Life or Death, it was 2 paragraphs in the Herald in 1995 about a man who escaped from Long Bay Jail on the day before he was due to be released, that I just carried out around with me for. He'd served two murder sentences. He was convicted of murder. He served 15 years, got released, and within 3 months had killed again, went back again. So he'd spent over 35 years behind bars and disappears the day before he's due to be released. So that's the sort of thing that you think, okay. But I will start a book like that with a prison breakout and having no idea how it's going to. And then to me, it's like climbing a mountain and the thing is like a rock face and you don't know, you can't see the top when you can only see the rock in front of you. And you don't know how far you've got to climb. You don't know how long it's going to be. You just have to keep climbing.
Do you climb sometimes halfway and decide to go back
Oh,
down a little bit?
Yeah, one of those things pull out and I fall at least a few hundred feet and have to start climbing again, and and so in that sense it doesn't get any easier. It's still the same process of not knowing how long it's going to be. And look, it sounds completely ridiculous, but I've always suffered from like this imposter syndrome. I mean, it's now been 17 novels, and I sign each book to my agent saying we've fooled them again. Yeah.
But that's probably a good thing, isn't it? If it got easy, if you became smug or you thought I can do this, it's not a problem. The books probably wouldn't be as good.
No, I mean, if you write each book convinced this is the book that's going to expose you as a complete fraud, who doesn't know what he's doing, then you just and it makes me an absolute nightmare to live with. But yeah, I mean it just drives you to see if you can be lucky one more time.
I feel the same way with journalism and articles I write. I think, when are they going to figure out that I'm not good at this, or this is a terrible story, or I have no sense of grammar or spelling, or I think that too.
Yeah, and I know it started in journalism for me as a feature writer and working on London newspapers, and every time you submitted it, you just thought this is the one that they're going to hurl back at you saying, what is this shit?
Yeah.
Or
you're only as good as your last front page, sort of, yeah.
Mark, fact and fiction again. Do you have you formed any views on what things the public don't really know or misunderstand about the criminal justice system or crimes? I mean, when dealing with juries, you must have had to think about this. What do I need to tell them? What assumptions might they jump to that are wrong? Have you any thoughts on that?
What I find is that the average person has no idea how complex some of these cases are. And I'll come away from a 3-month trial and there's been a conviction, and people will come up to me and say, oh, God, you did really well because you had no evidence. And I think, well, just because you didn't read about it in the paper doesn't mean I had no evidence. Yeah. What was I doing day after day in court for 3 months?
That's our fault. That's the media's fault, because they only allow us to go to your opening address. Then we ignore it for 3 months and we come in at the end when there's a guilty verdict because our bosses won't let us cover it properly.
So one of the reasons why I wrote Missing Presumed Dead was to explain to people how complex a police investigation of a murder can be, And the police investigation of Dorothy Davis's and Kerry Whelan's disappearances were amazing investigations.
Do you reckon?
And then how complex the trial is.
If let's say Kerry Whelan had been the only victim, I mean, how important was the fact that you could link it to another disappearance? Do you think?
I don't think he would have got away with Kerry Whelan's disappearance, but he had got away with Dorothy Davis's murder for 2 years. If he hadn't done anything after that, I think he would never have been prosecuted for her disappearance. The initial investigation of Dorothy Davis's disappearance was woefully inadequate, and it was only when Chief Inspector Dennis Bray, who was investigating the Kerry Whelan disappearance, found out that he'd been the only suspect in the disappearance of Dorothy Davis, that he started reinvestigating it, and it was done properly the second time, and he was eventually charged.
I'm taking over, Michael, just for one question. I just want one question. I'm really interested.
One more.
I don't often get someone. I mean, you can see I've got a book in mind here. No. Okay,
Research.
no. Given what happened to, with the Chris Dawson thing, if you murdered someone tomorrow, would you rather be tried in front of a judge only or a jury?
Oh, look, I'm a great proponent of the jury system. I love juries. I think jurors collectively, because there's 12 of them, have the wisdom of the community, the common sense of the community. And whilst judges are legally trained, that doesn't mean that they don't have their peccadillos and their pet likes and dislikes and their own prejudices. But on the other hand, there are so many cases today where there's the risk of prejudice that you go for a trial by judge alone. The defendant goes for a trial by judge alone. If there's the slightest whiff of some prior criminal history, the chances of a juror, despite being told that they should not look up the internet, actually going and looking up about the previous offence is so high that you can't really take that risk.
So if you were a killer, you'd go judge alone.
Depends. If it was my first one and I didn't have a
That's right. You guys should swap phone numbers after this session. Look, we're going to open up for questions in just a minute. So if anyone is watching us on Zoom, please, you're welcome to send in questions and they'll appear on the screen in front of me and we can ask those too. Just one last one before we do that. Emma, you've seen a lot of trials, and sticking with the jury system, have there been any where you think an innocent person was wrongly convicted?
No, I don't think so. But I often put myself in the shoes of the jurors, and I wonder how they would feel, that the responsibility of deciding that. In the Chris Dawson case, I was the media and my colleagues weren't sure whether or not Justice Harrison would find him guilty or not. We weren't sure if there was enough evidence. Personally, most people think he did kill Lynn, but we weren't sure whether there was the evidence there to convict him. So some people were surprised when he was convicted.
And the second part of that question, not naming names, has there been a case where you thought a guilty person got off?
Yes, there has been. Yes. And not naming names, it was just
yes, for obvious reasons.
But also, there's been a couple, but one in particular was not a very well-known case either. It was based on CCTV. It was more of an underworld gang, Middle Eastern gang type of thing, and it was clear to me that this man had murdered this person, and he was acquitted. And I found that really strange when I was standing outside and he walked past the doors and off he goes. And I just thought, I wonder why they didn't convict him there, because I would have if I had been on that jury.
But that's how the system operates, that it's better to have 10 guilty people found not guilty rather than have one innocent person found guilty.
I agree. I feel the same way. You'd rather let a few people go free rather than anyone innocent go to jail. Although I do question do you ever look at the jury sometimes and think, sometimes, they do tend to sometimes look like they either don't have jobs or they're students. I don't think it's a correct representation of society.
Emma's not talking about anyone here.
Yeah.
Yep.
No, I mean,
you know what I mean. I'm just saying that there's a
I
certain
once,
type of person that.
I once wrote a piece for a British newspaper and got myself charged with contempt because it was how to get out of jury duty.
Yeah, yeah.
You know, and it was because basically, if they want you for a long trial, you finish up with the unemployed or the unemployable. You know,
pretty much, yeah.
Because if you've got a job, you know, an important job or whatever, you know,
You can get out of jury duty.
And like even to the point where, you know, if you go with a whole lot of pens in your pocket, as though
I've
in
heard
notebooks,
that, I've heard that if you carry a copy of the Fin Review, that gets you out of jury duty as well.
Enough. We don't want to get charged with anything. Yeah. Okay, let's move on to questions, please. Yeah. So. Sorry, we just got to repeat the question. Who was it again? We might just give you a microphone, actually, if that's all right. Yeah. Let's do this properly.
Assuming people like Evie Cormack exist in real life, why wouldn't they be called to give expert evidence in every criminal trial?
Evie Cormack is the young girl, is the young woman in the books that can tell when someone's lying. It's a bit like that. Psychologists can get called to criminal trials to talk about state of mind before sentencing or whatnot, but their psychological evidence can't be used to actually convict someone. They did try it once in the UK with Colin Stagg and the murder of Rachel Nickel, and it was thrown out. The people like Evie that exist, the best that's ever been discovered, have an 85%. There was a particular former police officer in America called T.J. Newman, had an 85% ability to tell, not just when someone was verbally lying, but the emotional lies, the fake smiles and things like that. He could tell it to 85%. That's never going to be enough when it comes to putting someone in court to say whether someone's lying or not. So that's it's not foolproof.
I've got an interesting question here on Zoom, then I'll come back to the room. We could talk about this for a long time, but I'm just going to arbitrarily direct it to Emma. Do you agree that everyone has the potential to kill under the right circumstances? You can flick it on if you want.
No, I don't, but I'd like to hear Mark's answer.
I think that a frighteningly larger proportion of people than we would like to think are capable of committing murder in the right circumstances. Not everybody, hopefully not even a majority, but more than we would like to think.
I just read Jane Carrow's book, The Mother, the fiction book, and that plot in that book, I actually thought if I was in that woman's position, I would probably kill as well. I thought I would.
Yeah, the late great P.D. James, she obviously wonderful crime writer. She believed that everyone was capable, in the right circumstances, pushed hard enough. All the buttons being pushed. Whether it be that everyone was capable of it, and she believed that's one of the reasons that readers read crime fiction and wanted to explore that dark side, because somewhere deep inside we all wondered and asked the question, could we do that? Yeah.
Okay, next question from the room, please. Yourself there.
This is a question for Mark, which might help Michael's next book. Mark, I've heard you talk about the details of Ivan Milat's trial. The fact that even on his deathbed, he wasn't going to say whether there were more bodies out there, where there might be. And also somebody like Myra Hindley from the Moor Murders of the Children. Did that surprise you at all, or is that just like the ultimate narcissistic psychopath's power trip?
It doesn't surprise me at all, and it happens in many cases, and I think there are 2 or 3 reasons for it. One of them is what you mentioned, that this is the ultimate control, and people in jail have such an absence of control over their lives. Every aspect of their lives is determined by others, and here is the last vestige of control that they have. So that's part of it, but I think it goes further than that. Most people who are serving lengthy jail sentences, including Ivan Milat, have someone on the outside who still believes in them. And having that contact with the outside world is so important if you're serving a long sentence. Somebody who's going to come and visit you, somebody who will get things for you, perhaps put money in your account, things like that. If you come out and say, oh yes, I did this dreadful crime and this is where the bodies are, they run the risk of losing that last contact with the outside world. So I think that's another reason why people like Ivan Milat would, to the end, deny their involvement.
And
so-
Ivan's brother
Dreadful crime.
still strongly defends him.
Yeah.
And that's a bit like they were hoping, weren't they, with Bruce Burrell, that there'd be some sort of deathbed confession that he'd
Correct.
reveal
Correct.
where the bodies were.
Yep.
Because he knew he was dying, that this might be an opportunity
That's
that
right.
could overcome that.
Yep.
Really.
And I think with him, it was again both those reasons.
Another question. Sorry, we just might move maybe let's just move up the room, then we'll come back down the front. There's one up the back there, if we don't mind.
T.J. Newman, he was identified by Professor Paul Ekman, who's probably the world's leading expert on lying. And it was a TV series several years ago called Lie to Me, based upon the work of Paul Ekman. But T.J. Newman.
I think this gentleman here might be the next. Did you?
Can you please refresh my memory about how long did Natasha Darcy get?
Oh my goodness, isn't this bad that I have forgotten? But I think it's was about 30 years on the bottom and minimum, and 40 on the top as a maximum.
Because I went to a lot
It was
of
one of the longest
trials.
sentences given to a woman in New South Wales.
I think she should have got life.
Yeah, well, so did I. Yeah.
Second question, or that's it? That's a comment. Yeah. Okay. Thanks. Yeah.
Mark, has there been any resolution of the Bogle-Chandler mystery?
There has indeed. And there's a podcast that's come out fairly recently about the Bogle-Chandler mystery. There is no doubt about how Mr. Bogle and Mrs. Chandler, I can't remember which one was, Bogle and Chandler died. They laid down on the grass next to the Lane Cove River. The environmental conditions that night were such that very toxic gases from the mud of the river, caused by industrial activities over decades and decades and decades, caused toxic fumes, in particular sulfur dioxide, to completely overwhelm them. And sulfur dioxide is a substance that once you breathe it in, it prevents your brain from uptaking oxygen. So even if you get up and walk away, you can still die from it. And it's been proven now, in my view, beyond a reasonable doubt, that that's how they died. They were having a sexual tryst, yes. They both were, certainly one of them was in an open marriage. I'm not sure about the other, but it's now been conclusively shown that that's how they died.
And to confuse the fact that didn't someone come along and cover one of the bodies with a cardboard sheet or something, which
Yes.
for the police was just a...
Somebody came along and covered their bodies and took away something, I can't remember what it was now, and discarded it like suburbs away in the bush where it was found by the police. And the toxicologist who was working on the case was interviewed for this podcast. He worked for something like 18 months full time, trying to work out what had overcome these two people, and never thought that it might be some toxic residue from the river, and investigated every possible poison and radiation and couldn't find any poison in the body that could have accounted for their deaths. And it was always thought that they'd been murdered, perhaps because of his work with the CSIRO, or somebody who was jealous of the fact that they were in this liaison, but it had nothing to do with that. It was much more, in a way, much more sinister, that the killer was the river.
Okay, I think we have to leave it there. Thanks very much. Can I just check the way out? Is that door there, is it? Or this door here? Fantastic. Books will be on sale, of course, as always. I'd just like to give a big shout out to our volunteers who've been with us in some cases for many years, and we couldn't do it without them, quite literally. So thank you for that. And also, can we thank our three guests? Thanks very much.